so much for joining us today. My name's Dave Rees. I'm the managing partner at Convergence. Really looking forward to this morning's conversation. I've been excited about this one for quite some time. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest this morning, Fiona Hewitt.
Kia ora.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us. As advertised, Fiona and I are going to deep dive into the world of AI this morning, but specifically, we're going to focus on the world of work, how it's going to impact New Zealand organisations, how it's going to impact the future of work and talent, all that sort of thing. So that's our agenda for the morning. As you may be aware, Fiona is the founder of a consulting firm called Unboxable. So very much focused on the future of work. She works with a lot of executive teams and boards, helping them to navigate what is a profound change for us all. Just before we get into it, a quick word on format. So Fiona and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll move into a Q&A for about 15 minutes at the end. So I'd encourage you, I think the chat function in Zoom is open. I definitely recommend dropping your questions in there as and when they arise, rather than leaving them right to the end. That way I can try and weave them into the conversation if possible, but if not, we'll definitely get to them at the end. So without any further ado, Fiona, we are all sort of amidst a huge amount of change at the moment. We're all coming up to speed with what is an entirely new vernacular with agents and prompts, etc. But I guess that all still feels reasonably tactical. What are we missing there? What is the more sort of strategic layer to this, if you will?
Yeah, it's a really good question to start off the conversation today. So the way I see it is that prompting agents, that's the start. It's certainly not the finish. And I think what people are doing is they're treating AI as the sea change, but actually it's just a change. And fundamentally what the change is, or what AI is bringing, is a requirement for us to look at how do we design the work, how do we operate around the work, how do we structure our teams, not necessarily how we restructure our teams, but how do we structure the teams so we can become more effective and impactful in the work that we do. So what I'm sort of seeing is that people are treating AI as the deployment rather than actually the first domino that comes off the rank in the way that you look at work.
Interesting. Okay. So we should be thinking about it more as a sort of operating model conversation.
Yeah.
And how does this affect the world of work rather than the tactical deployment of tech?
Yes.
Okay. Given that, which is quite a profound shift, how does that impact leadership? If we're going to break this up into sort of three key areas, I guess leadership's going to be massively impacted. What are you seeing as kind of the immediate impact on that?
So leadership will always remain important. Good leadership, the fundamentals of it will also stay the same. But what I think is leadership will require to evolve for this changing context. And I think when I think about how much information is on tap, we're entering what we call the intelligence era, where knowledge is instantly accessible. So value is now not having the information. It's about how you use that information. So how that plays out from a leadership point of view is, what are the decisions that you make? What's the judgment or oversight or context you add to that information? So I think those kind of pieces around judgment, sense-making, problem-solving become to the fore. There's kind of two other interesting things that are coming up. I'm seeing more so globally than necessarily in New Zealand. One is everyone needs to become an AI practitioner. And that is from your CEO right down to your frontline workers. So that's a really interesting shift, because when you see how technology has been deployed in the past, it's been something that IT have rolled out. But actually AI is fundamentally changing all our roles and the way we should think about our roles. So I see that's really changing and needs to change. And I think my observation from a New Zealand context is we're probably still treating it a little bit as a tech deployment. So I think that's a bit of a shift. The other thing that's really interesting, and I can apply it to my own career, is that as we become more senior and become in more senior roles in organisations, we often became further away from the work. And there's starting to be a shift globally that managers and senior managers need to start getting back closer to the work, because the transformation is understanding how your work gets done, and therefore how do you redesign your work. So there's some really interesting shifts when it comes to leaders and leadership.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of the truisms of leadership will be enduring, but are there new capabilities and attitudes, mindsets that you'd point to and say, well, these are what's going to be critical, at least with sort of best guess based on what we know right now?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting one because I think you can't future-proof organisations or leadership, but you can become what I would call more future fluent. So the difference for me is future proofing to me almost implies a known destination. You know where you're going and you've prepared accordingly. Future fluent is we're actually really not sure where we're going, but actually we need to develop skills so that we can adapt, we can evolve, we can shift, and we can sense those levers as they change. The one thing to make it really practical is I think we need to really start focusing quite deeply on our change capability. In the past, we've treated change as something that's finite, there's a beginning, there's an end. But actually we need to build a change muscle that allows you to be adaptive and evolve all the time. So you're leading with change rather than leading through change. And I think for organisations, what that means is actually, if you can't handle change, you're going to find probably the next 5 to 10 years really difficult and problematic. You'll struggle. And so as a first practical wave for me is how do you build that change capability and muscle more strongly in your organisation?
Yeah, again, are there sort of practical ways that you would go about that? You know, if you're looking to make recommendations, how do you build that change capability?
So there's a couple of things in there for me. One is what is the culture you're creating? And I think what's interesting is not saying that culture hasn't been important over the last 5 years, but building a more adaptive culture is going to be really critical for organisations. How do you prepare your people for change? A lot can be seen in how do you communicate about change? Do you talk about it a lot with your people? Often organisations are reticent to talk about change because we're not fully formed yet. We haven't got it perfect. But actually the whole point is we're all transitioning. None of it's going to be perfect. So being able to talk and lead with clarity in those moments is going to be really important. I think where you spend your attention and how you talk about things, how do you talk about trying things, how do you share learnings amongst your organisation, it's kind of a multifaceted approach. But I think if you start there, actually that can help you build what we call an adaptive muscle for an organisation or for leadership.
Yeah, interesting. It almost feels like we're never going to reach this fully formed state, that we're in a perpetual state of change and flux.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. You mentioned about that sort of change capability. There's a recent study came out, HR and LTRR 2026. 100% of organisations are navigating significant change, and only 10% of leaders actually feel equipped to navigate that change. So what is it about the way that leadership development has been done, or the mindset of leaders that is making them feel so sort of unequipped to handle this?
There's a couple of ways that, and these are my personal opinions. I think from a personal point of view, I think the way that our careers have grown and developed, we have been paid or hired for a certain expertise. That's your value. You get into an organisation, you deliver on your value, and that's how you sort of play your pride and ego in relation to what you do. That's starting to shift. So what was valuable for you 5 years ago may not be valuable for you in the next 5 years. So that's quite confronting. So I think there's a level of anxiety around, do I have a part to play in this? So I think on a personal level, you see that playing out. And then from an organisational point of view, I feel that we're trying to make things like they were, but actually we can't. So, the culture, the capabilities, the leadership skills, we actually need to do them quite differently now. And I think talk about them quite differently. So getting people comfortable with change or not knowing where this is going to play out is so important. I talk about this sort of concept of you can't open new doors with old keys. And so we actually need to start reframing what are we capable of, or what is the journey we need to take as an organisation, and be really open about that. I also think the challenge for organisations is that we spend a lot of time fixing today's problems and not giving enough time or space for actually thinking about tomorrow's implications.
Yeah, I guess in some ways that kind of proves the case of the benefits of AI, right? If we've not created the capacity or got the capacity to be able to think about those things,
yes,
AI creates more capacity, we're then able to sort of work on the business rather than in the business.
Yes.
That sort of old
Without
adage.
a doubt. And it's interesting, right? Like I was doing some speaking in an event a couple of weeks ago talking about AI, and everyone pretty much said, no, we're very progressed from our AI strategy. It's fully embedded. We're on the journey. And I said, okay, so do you use agents? Oh, no, we don't use agents. Okay, do you use it within your function to deliver programs of work? Oh, no, we don't do that. But we've done the training. And actually, we've got to take this from I've learned how to use a tool to actually go, how do we look at the organisation in a different way?
Yeah, so part of this is, I'm guessing quite a bit of an awareness problem, right? Like we're looking at a chatbot and thinking that's what AI is,
yes.
versus educating ourselves to understand more expansively
yes.
what the potential is.
Absolutely.
Do you see that as a New Zealand problem? Is that a global problem? Like, how are we tracking against overseas organisations?
Yeah, it's an interesting one to make. I think New Zealand is interesting. I think we've actually adopted AI. I think the numbers are actually higher than Australia, but adopting AI isn't necessarily embedding AI, and I think there's a difference between that. I think from a New Zealand point of view, we often think, okay, the States is quite different. You know, a large tech company, we're not that, and so we're not necessarily proposing that. But I think we have a productivity issue in New Zealand, and I think we're a perfect example of increasing productivity is using AI as a technology, but actually using AI to look at how do you deliver work? What are the ways that you can get efficiency? I think most of our organisational size is perfect for being able to use AI. The ability to adapt and the simplicity and less bureaucracy, it gives perfect conditions to actually be able to start innovating in really meaningful ways.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting, though, when you think about the attitudes towards AI, there are people that absolutely embrace it, understand the potential of it, and are acting accordingly. Whereas a lot of people, the attitude seems to be, this is just another piece of tech. We rolled out email in the 90s, and we got cloud computing, and this is just another tech rollout. So is there objective evidence out there to support the fact that this needs to sort of lead into operating models, that this is going to disrupt business models? What's the kind of the support?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think the last 12 months particularly, there's been a lot of noise, a lot of hype, and actually people have got quite desensitized to the AI big story. And there's really conflicting evidence around there. So we've had, in the last 12 months, you've had sort of AI washing where organisations are using it as a reason why they're taking 10% of the workforce out, when actually evidence stacks up that that's actually probably not the case, but they're using it as the rationale why. So that creates sort of fear and anxiety in relation to it. I think large organisations are starting to get their return on investment on AI, but part of the slowness in that has been the fact that we've treated it like a tool rather than actually, to me, it's a force. Like the potential and opportunity has some really great ramifications. It has some scary ones, right? And I think everyone is trying to work their way through that. I think whether you're a Microsoft or you're a small business of two people, that transition is really important and actually can really apply to you in relation to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's almost the case, the less you embrace it, the scarier it is.
Yes.
Right? Because you're writing your own sort of future without actually being aware of it. You're making a choice without making a conscious choice, if that makes sense. What are you seeing out there? I mean, you're sort of a cross set from a global perspective. So what are you seeing in leading organisations globally? You mentioned Australia as an example. If we look further afield, what are you seeing there in comparison with New Zealand? Are we ahead in some instances, not in others? What's the comparison?
I think the conversations are a little bit further advanced globally, and the conversations that I think I've really noticed have started to begin this year. So one is around moving from AI individual adoption to organisational adaptation. So how do you use the collective intelligence of AI as a tool in your team or function to drive better productivity rather than using it on an individual nature to summarise emails or record meetings? Then the workforce conversations are becoming much more explicit, not from a restructuring point of view, but how do we organise our workforce in a different way for this new reality? And I think that's a really good thing to look at. How do we become more dynamic in the way that we structure our teams? I think the management layer is under pressure around what's that middle management role and how does that play in organisations that are becoming really automated. So I think that's a really interesting step over the next 12 to 18 months around how those roles sort of play out. And then the other piece that's starting to really become more evident is this culture and capabilities conversation. So actually recognising if we deploy tech, we have to invest in human capabilities as well. If you do one without the other, you're not going to get that unlock. And if you're having a culture that's still quite resistant to AI or resistant to change, you are not going to get those transformational outcomes. So I think the conversations become much more about the tool and actually about the organisation.
Yeah, okay. Are you able to sort of break that down for us in a bit more detail? Because it'd be interesting just to understand how should organisations think about walking that path. There's so much right now with these ambiguous and uncertain. How do you move forward? How do you think about sort of redesign or, reconfiguring operating models?
So I talk about it in three ways with organisations: work, workforce, workplace. And what I mean by that is really understand how is work being done in your organisation in the first instance. The second thing is how is your workforce galvanised around that work? And then the third piece is how do you organise, make decisions? So if you can look at it in that way, what I've seen globally, and we've seen this play out in the press quite a lot, is people start with the structure first, and then they look at teams, and then they look at work. So you've had a lot of scenarios, even in Australia, where they've changed the structure, they've let a lot of people go, and then they've realised they hadn't actually changed the way that they were working and have had to bring people back. So the first thing is actually understand the work and the opportunities in there. And that doesn't have to be really complicated. It could be just within a team. You go, okay, guys, where are the things that cause us pain? Where are the things that slow us down? What are the things that are painful? Or what are the things that we repeat every day, day in, day out, that we could automate? So having those conversations so that people can spend their time on things that deliver greater strategic value, that's where the opportunity is.
Yeah, again, how do you think about enabling that? What I mean by that is we can all think through a process and where it might be dragging or inefficient, but without knowledge of what the improvement potential is and what the tool sets are, it's hard for us to sort of reimagine a different future. Yeah. So, if you're thinking about walking along a path that's going to improve that, what sort of cross-functional teams or who owns that? How does that objective?
It's a really good question, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. But I think there's a couple of facets to this, and to me, it's like an onion. There's so many layers. And I guess the complexity is there isn't one answer or one approach. But for me, there's a couple of things. One, often the person closest to the problem has the answer. So the person who's delivering that piece of work knows where it falls down. So getting their voice in the room is really important. I think understanding everybody's role in the room. So what I'm noticing a lot at the moment is, I wouldn't say friction, but there's this interesting thing playing out where AI was rolled out by your chief technology officer. The CPO, who owns kind of capabilities, behaviour, culture, hasn't really had an opportunity to look at, well, if we're enabling AI, what does that kind of mean from a how do we get people to adopt it or ways of working? So it's quite separate when actually that should be really joined. Then you've got chief transformation officers at the moment going, well, I'm just delivering a program, but I'm noticing there's a culture and a behavioural piece that that's not my remit. So actually our roles need to be much more adaptive in what our responsibilities are or how we work across the organisation. So I'm certainly seeing the rise of much more cross-functional teams that come in, surgeon, address a problem, look at a solution, fix it, surge out again. So actually the dynamicness in our organisations needs to change so we can do that.
Yeah, so is that the priority then? If you're looking at a first step, it's reimagining how collaboration looks like at an exec team level before it can filter down into a sort of a process level through the organisation?
Without a doubt. And look, if I think back at my executive career, there have been some highlights and there's been some lowlights. And some of those lowlights have been sitting around a table thinking and discussing a problem, but you don't own that problem. And so your ability to meaningfully contribute to solve it is diminished. So actually this kind of collective intelligence or collective solving, I think, is much more important for the context that we're operating or moving into from an organisational point of view.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you talk about this concept of the intelligent operating model, which you kind of touched on there, but can you just expand upon that a little bit, just to give people a sense, I think, of what the future state might look like?
Yeah. So an operating model is simply how your organisation delivers on its strategy. So there's components to that around what is the work, what does our workforce do, what are the decisions that we make, and what's the technology that we apply to enable that. So it's actually all the just of different components of your organisation and how they come together. I think what's happened is a lot of organisations have been set up for what was something that worked 5 years ago, 8 years ago, but your businesses have changed, they've grown, and now you've got this new component of AI, which is fundamentally influencing how work is being delivered. And what we need to do is start going, so what is the new model for our organisation? How do we operate and pull all those bits together? Now that sounds really complex, but it actually doesn't have to be, but it's just validating what needs to be true for us to be able to work at our most effectiveness or optimum. And I think a lot of people don't re-look at how their organisation is operating enough for the context and the change that's happening now.
Yeah, okay. So obviously operating models is not something you want to rejig, every 5 minutes.
That's right.
But whereas it used to be a sort of a set and forget type thing, do you feel like the frequency of change, the frequency of review, is that going to be faster than going forward?
Most definitely. And I think I was talking to an organisation last week around how do we need to build design capability in your leadership team, which is something that we've never had to look like before, so that they become much more prepared and equipped to go, is the structure of this team the right? Is it working in a way that it needs to? How do we think about the work? Where do we deliver value in this new context? So actually building some slightly different capabilities so that everyone can contribute to how the organisation operates is going to be really important.
Yeah. As you say, it's a new capability for so many organisations. It's typically going to start at the exec team and then it's going to filter down. But one of the trends with AI seems to be the democratization. It's this ubiquitous information. Knowledge isn't siloed in the way that it was before, and so decision making, for example, can be democratized as well, at lower levels of the organisation. And so from an op model perspective, you start thinking about how do we redesign decision rights?
Without a doubt.
And there's so to come back to your point about design, that I'm presuming shouldn't be solely the realm of the exec team. Like how sort of ubiquitous do skill sets like that need to become through an organisation, do you think?
In my opinion, they need to be that should be absolutely throughout the whole organisation. I think decision making and problem solving are two things that organisations need to really hone in on to help them build this kind of change and adaptive capability. I think decision making often is owned by too few, and actually that slows you down, whereas you need to start decentralising decision making, obviously with parameters and guardrails and all of that from that perspective, but so that people can contribute in a meaningful way but get work done in a simple way. And I think that is where AI has been interesting, because it's amplified what works well in an organisation but also what doesn't.
I mean, that sounds like it's going to be confronting for quite a few leaders who have, had that decision-making domain solely to themselves. But again, that sort of speaks to a mindset shift there, right?
Yes. I think we're fundamentally, this is about a mindset shift. it's about re-looking at your capabilities individually from a professional point of view, but also an organisational point of view about what worked may not be what will work moving forward. We need to look at things in a different way. And then actually, how is work designed? And I think if we can go back to how has the work been done, and we've all been there in our roles where we do some tasks where we think, oh God, this is so painful and so repetitive, and I don't even know if it delivers value, but we become that hamster on the wheel where we just keep delivering, but actually in service of what? And I think that opportunity, regardless of AI, to take a step back and go, are we still delivering value in the way that we think, is a really important conversation.
Are there parts of an operating model that you feel are more likely to break sooner than others? If you think about the AI impact, what breaks first, I guess is...
I think decision making and problem solving are two. That will happen quite quickly on small scales and large scales. I think what happens in organisations as well, and look, I've been guilty of this as well, is that around that leadership table, you're focusing on the problem of today. But actually, we somehow need to carve out time to start thinking about the implications of tomorrow. And so making sure that our time focus is not just around this week, this month, this quarter, but actually about how do we start designing the organisation for what we think comes next. Because you've got to breadcrumb your way to that. It's not a mountain that you climb overnight. And so how can you build that flex in your thinking and share that with your people and go on that journey with your people is going to be really important.
Yeah, how do you do that? How do you satisfy those two masters, as it were? I mean, you've written, I think, about this dual mandate concept where organisations, on the one hand, obviously you've got an imperative to keep performing, but on the other, they've also got this imperative to transform. There's only so many hours in a day. So
there are so many hours in a day.
How do we think about that?
And I think one is, where do you spend your time and attention? So first off, when I think about leadership teams, if you're spending 100% of your time on today's problem, that is all you're going to solve. And so actually, how do you make sure that you're having those strategic conversations and those tactical solving? You need to factor that into your rhythms. I think how you communicate to your people, how you share what you're trying to work on. I think what is the culture and the capabilities that you're building in your organisation. It's not easy. I think also how we reward and recognise the efforts and output of our people, because this is where things like KPIs and bonuses and incentives can actually work against you, because it's all about short-term delivery rather than long-term delivery. And so this is where this org design for me piece really needs to be relooked at, because some of these components were perfect for 10 years ago, but are they still fit for purpose for where organisations are anticipated to go?
Yeah, interesting. There's a question that's come up here which I think is quite appropriate for where we're at. If AI is fundamentally changing both cost structures and decision velocity, what organisational capabilities should leaders prioritise stopping or letting go of, not just building, to remain competitive in the next 3 to 5 years?
So I think it's a really good question, and I don't know if we all have the answer yet, right? So this is the thing, there's no playbook for this, but I think if you're conscious of the fact that you need to stay in a sort of dynamic approach to work, keep looking up and out. And that's either from what's happening in your organisation through to what's happening in your industry to what are global trends. I think at times we become quite head down in our work to get through, whereas actually we need to create space to really understand what the change is. But I think in a really simple context, if you can just start refreshing your change capability in a way that is adaptive and not around change management, I think is a really good step forward in relation to that.
So we've all got to own that.
You've all got to own that. I think this is a personal journey and a organisational journey. And so from an individual point of view, one thing I feel really strongly about is I think we need to start seeing our career as an asset and that it's dynamic. And so we need to ensure that we're investing the value in our career as an asset so that we stay valuable and we stay relevant.
In a different way to what we might have done sort of historically.
Yes, because it would have been, look, I'm a chief marketing officer and I'm really good at marketing. We've got to be way more dynamic than that. And I think we're going to start seeing CPOs that are becoming CPOs and tech, or tech people are going to be becoming tech and people. And so how do you broaden your skill set so you can operate in a much broader way?
Yeah, interesting. So that kind of leads us into that conversation about the talent aspect. How do you look at talent in a different way? I mean, we've had almost the same perspective on it for such a long time.
Yeah.
As you point out, it's a difficult question to answer because so much of what we're going through now, it's all hazy, it's unknowable. But are there some pointers to how organisations should start thinking about talent to sort of make themselves sort of future fluent?
Yeah. Now, I think I might get a bit controversial here, Dave, and I am aware that you run a recruitment agency. So I think that we need to start really looking at talent quite differently. And it's quite funny, right? Like I think about the last 20, 25 years of my career, I've always been told you need to specialise. You need to be really deep and deeply experienced on something. I'm not sure that that's true anymore. And so actually, I think it's the rise of the generalist, the person who has a good set of skills that can be taken and used in any context. Now, I know that sounds a bit like Liam Neeson from Taken, but what I sort of mean by that is that if you have good cognitive skills, that you can look at things with a level of empathy, curiosity, you've got good systems thinking, problem solving, all of those things could actually be really successful in any context. And so for me, I think there's a shift of what have you done in the past to what could you do in the future. So there's a kind of repackaging of how can I use my skills in a much different way. I think that's difficult because then we have to think about hiring in a different way. And, you know, you can speak to this much more than I can in relation to it's been a difficult employment market over the last 12 to 18 months. And so it's easier just to hire people that tick the box. But actually, maybe we need to start hiring for what the potential of those people are, not necessarily what they've done in the past.
Yeah, so to some extent, it's reconfiguring what those boxes are that we're looking to tick. The challenge, I think, is from a selection point of view. We're not great at knowing whether somebody's ticking the boxes. You know, we think we can know it when we see it. We often rely on gut instinct, and that's kind of definitely fallible. So are there frameworks in place, or do you see frameworks changing as to how organisations are evaluating talent, or do you think we're looking at the same sort of signals as we always have?
I think to a certain extent, I think we're looking at the same signals we've always had, but maybe it's that we don't quite have the tools yet to look at recruiting in a slightly different and more dynamic way. But I think you'll see technology over the next 2 to 4 years, particularly, that will come out globally, that will start addressing some of those things around how do you assess for cognitive patterns, capability. So using sort of almost psychology assessments in a much different way. I think as part of that, when you're hiring, you also need to know what you're hiring for. And so it's really easy to replace a role you've already had. But again, I think we're going to transition in the way we start thinking about, can we use this role in a much more broader context in the future, which means we need to think about skills and capability in a much broader way.
Yeah, it feels to me like organisations are at the very start of that journey.
Yes.
The number of conversations I've had this year with CPOs that are looking at redeveloping leadership development, mindful that a lot of leadership capability isn't where it needs to be, particularly around change management, but it doesn't feel like yet that we're at the point where that's starting to filter down into how do we think about competency change and job redesign.
Yeah.
Which I guess is coming, but if you're making a permanent hire, the word permanent, signifies it's going to be quite enduring. So the sooner that you start thinking about capabilities and competencies, the more likely you are to hire people that have got that sort of future fluent capability to them.
Without a doubt. And I think what's interesting is that the way even our employment agreements are set up, they're probably not fit for purpose in a future world. Now, I'm not suggesting that they need to be looked at now, but we hire people, and as soon as their job changes roughly 30%, we may have to look at making that role redundant. And I think somehow there's these sort of big conversations at some point, and these are global conversations, not just New Zealand, but how do we make employment more fit for purpose so that we can use our people in a much more dynamic way? So that's an interesting thing at some point. But I think in the meantime, where CPOs or people teams or hiring managers can start thinking about is be really clear about what your strategy is for the organisation and where you think it's going, and start questioning what are the kind of people that we probably need to deliver on this strategy. And it just may mean that you're not always hiring like for like when you're going out to market, thinking about people in a much more broader way. And can those skills be transferred to be used in this context as much as they can be used in that context?
Yeah, I think the skills question is a harder one to answer because it's such a changeable state that knowing what skills are going to be appropriate, 2-3 years down the track is a challenging one. But definitely from a competency and mindset perspective, I think that's much more knowable. If you're hiring for some of the things that have been trends for the last, 5+ years, communication, collaboration, creativity, all that sort of thing, it's very hard to foresee a future where those things aren't relevant anymore.
Yes.
So you're kind of building in, I guess you're kind of protecting yourself against obsolescence by hiring people that have got that sort of skill set.
And look, one of the things that I've seen, which I think is really encouraging, is that this conversation now is that if you're investing in technology, you need to be spending the same investing in your people, because I think the real unlock with where technology is anticipated to go is the connection between human and technology. And so actually enabling your people to optimize what they do with the opportunity of technology is really important. And I think what we're doing at the moment is we're probably spending on the tech, but maybe not investing as the same equivalent into our people.
Yeah, that thought is, I think, quite counterintuitive to a lot of people. I think there's definitely... all organisations exist fundamentally for shareholder return, and so there's a tantalising prospect of being able to realign what headcount looks like by investing in technology. So expand a little bit, if you would, on why the rationale to invest both in tech and in people at the same time.
So one, it's productivity. So for me, I think PwC came out with a report this morning, a global report, basically saying the combination of AI and human capabilities is delivering in some organisations 146% higher productivity output. So actually you can get a business outcome from it if you want to take it down to that route. So actually what you're doing is you're investing in your business fundamentally. But I think as an organisations, we have an obligation to deliver a profit, but we also have an obligation for our people. And I think we are going to go through what is going to be one of the biggest workforce transitions or transformations over the next 5 to 10 years, regardless of what size of organisation or industry or where you're located globally and in New Zealand. We are going to be changing how our work is done and structured and how we employ people. So understanding that, I think, is really important. Whether that's 18 months away, 24 months away, the timeline I can't predict. What I can predict is the change. And so how do organisations and leaders start breadcrumbing their way into that reality now? So how are they enabling their people? How are they developing their people? How are they giving them a small amount of time to focus on the what-if possibilities within their roles are going to be really important facets to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key there is we've all got to own this. This isn't an HR thing. This is an organisational-wide thing. Right?
Agreed.
Questions popped up here. How can you persuade leaders that AI is more about the opportunities and upsides than the costs?
Well, that's such a good question, isn't it? You would like to think you don't have to. But I think one is around education and two is awareness. I think depending on the size of the organisation, let's use an organisation that's got a GM of HR, a GM of technology. Those two people need to start forming a really strategic relationship in the first instance. I think educating both of them in relation to how tech is going to enable people and how people are going to enable tech is a really important relationship so that they have a really strong conversation and position when it comes to that leadership table. I think more broadly in all organisations, it's around education. Like I rolled out a couple of AI deployment programs for some organisations. The first week when you train people, they save 2 hours of time, and then that sort of goes up for 6 weeks and then it drops away because they haven't actually really learnt how to optimise AI to deliver better outcomes. They've just learnt it to write a couple of papers and some emails. So actually, how are you training people with AI and on what makes a massive difference? So I just think it concerns me if we're in a position now that we're having to persuade leaders, because the evidence, the communications, the proof is out there. And so they have a responsibility to investigate that, in my mind.
Yeah, completely agree. Something else I wanted to touch on is early careers. There's been so much written about it. There's been a lot of press around how graduate intakes, for example, have been diminishing in a number of different industries. Legal profession, for example, consulting's another one. But it kind of introduces the conundrum of how do we build capability when sort of the bottom or early sort of stage rungs of the career ladder are being automated away.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I knew you were going to ask this question, and I did a little bit of research. And actually, whilst some industries are showing a reduction, it's actually not significant in others. So I think what I'm saying is they're still hiring. They may be hiring less, but they're hiring differently. So what they're doing is they're re-looking at those roles and their accountability. So actually they operate in a much more broader way than what they perhaps used to in the past. And where before they may produced something as an artifact as part of their job, maybe now they assess something. So their focus changes slightly in the way that they operate. I think I was reading something about roles are being seniorized. I think that's an adjective, much earlier on. So you're exposing them to much more broader ways of working, customer interactions, sales conversations. So actually you're building that exposure to them much earlier because they need to operate in a different way now. So therefore they need to understand more in those more junior roles than what they have traditionally before. I think there's a really interesting responsibility piece around if the ladder is being pulled up, how do we help them climb? And I think fundamentally that's something that we need to all try and solve together, because otherwise our workforce is in jeopardy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes down to role design, whereas an entry-level role might have spent a year doing the same task repetitively, even graduate intake, for example. That upskilling is being fast-tracked and condensed into a much briefer time.
Yes.
I was reading I think it was a Bain report recently that was kind of saying this is going to be review, not do. So analysts coming in are not going to build 100 models. They're going to be reviewing models, and that's going to condense and fast-track their experience. But that's going to require the redesign of the job, the rethinking of how we give them the context and the judgment earlier on, rather than expect them to achieve it over sort of 5 years or so.
I agree. I read something about deliberate learning rather than learning on the job. So how do we create those deliberate learning moments that actually they can engage and be exposed? What's interesting is if we stay in a hybrid working environment, how do those people get that exposure if you're not in an office being exposed to those conversations, those meetings? And so again, it's about how do we make learning deliberate for those people in those roles? Yeah,
it's almost trying to, if they're not exposed through osmosis, it's how do we codify that sort of judgment?
Absolutely.
That we can impart it to people, not necessarily in real time, but interesting. Any examples you can think of working with New Zealand companies that have delivered real returns from deploying and using AI tools?
So where I've seen the most value of some of the pieces of work that I've done is where we've gone into working with functions and teams and really unpacking the ways of working. So, for example, doing work with some HR teams around what's their recruitment process like? How can we codify that using AI? How do we write better position descriptions or job ads? How do we onboard people more effectively? So I think where the learning is real and drives real impact is when you go in and work on actual parts of an organisation. So AI is a great one. Finance is another one of where we've really delivered significant time savings as well as an improvement on information and quality by codifying or using AI in real workflows in relation to that. So finding those user cases where work is manual, repetitive, slow, or could be done much faster, that's where you get the value at this point.
Yeah, do you feel from your experience that this is being tracked well enough? I mean, a lot of us are using these tools in isolation. We're playing with chatbots or whatever. We're getting documents in 2 seconds flat versus the hours it would have taken us before. But I don't know whether that is being documented so that you can view what the return is. What's your experience there?
Yeah, so that's definitely a really strong point that I notice, is that when we go in and work with organisations on AI, we set up a whole kind of governance and operating framework. So you've got sign-offs, you know who owns the process, who assures it, but what are the metrics that tell you that it's actually working and delivering value? So I think that component you can set up quite effectively when you start working through use cases. I think where the interesting transition is that people are saving time and then just shoving more work into the pipe. So we're still working as hard, but actually how can we repurpose some of that time to be actually continually looking forward rather than continuing putting things in your pipe for today? So that whole kind of work balance thing, I still don't think we've addressed, even though you may be saving time at an individual or collective level.
Yeah, it feels like that we'll always get new work in to absorb the capacity that we've created.
Yeah.
And I think unless we're deliberate and conscious about how we use that time, it's just going to get absorbed with more busy work.
Yeah.
What I don't see so much is organisations consciously thinking, okay, what is the higher order list of responsibilities that people could undertake, and how do we consciously move from one to the other?
Yeah.
But it may be too soon to start seeing that. A couple of questions just before we move into a Q&A. So just a reminder just to drop any questions, any thoughts you have into the chat. If you had 3 things CEOs and CPOs should prioritise in the next 12 months, what would you put on that list?
So it goes back to that sort of framework of work, workforce, workplace. So go and look for those pain points about how are we delivering work, how are we organising our work, and is there areas of opportunity? I think, how are you building that change muscle in your organisation, that adaptiveness that allows your people to move with you as things adapt and evolve? And then the third component for me is, where are you spending your time? Because if you're spending your time on fixing something for today, you're removing the ability to set your business up for tomorrow. So really being conscious of, are you creating space at those critical moments, not all the time, that you can actually focus on the designing of your business or organisation is going to be really important.
And is that as straightforward as deliberately partitioning that time, just being really intentional about it? Is it? It's
certainly a start. I don't know if it's that simple, but you've got to start somewhere, right? And I think for me, if I give anyone advice, wanted or not, in relation to either themselves, is actually when you go into work, look at where are you spending your time? What are you working on? And is it of value anymore? And so getting comfortable with reviewing and critiquing our own performance, our own attention, our own capabilities is going to be as equally as important as how an organisation does that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's almost this sort of metacognitive layer to it, right? Where it's like, instead of just doing the task, let's think about why we're doing the task, what the value contribution is, and how we could do it differently. It's having that level of analysis through pretty much everything we do.
Agreed.
How can managers encourage and lead with AI adoption? How do they build AI capabilities while also managing heavy workloads? That kind of speaks to the dual mandate that we touched on earlier.
It's a really difficult one. So one, I think you lead through the adoption of yourself. And so actually you can't ask something of others that you're not doing yourself. So sharing that journey and opportunity, I think this is a courage and vulnerability moment for managers, because you're learning something that others are learning at the same time. So you have no seniority advantage, really. And so showing how you're learning, adapting, asking questions, use the work to learn. Don't do it as a side project. Whatever project you've got on, use AI in that to see if there's any opportunities to unlock. So bring it into the work. Don't make it a side thing. And so actually then you can learn together and then share what's working, what's not working, what prompts did you use, did you build an agent? So that actual shared learning together in the work is the way to deliver value and learn and make it feel much more approachable for people.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's this kind of adoption of this kind of experimentation and curiosity mindset. And there's a habitual part to it too, in the same way as we all learn to use Google every 5 seconds, we just need to integrate AI, which is a bit of a journey for everybody.
Right.
What about 3 pitfalls? What we talked about, what CEOs and CPOs should prioritize, but if you're thinking in the other direction, where are the bear traps? What should be avoided?
So treating AI as a tech deployment that I'm fundamentally feel really passionate about that, because if you treat it as a tech deployment, then you're just going to treat it as a tool. So the question shouldn't be what tool do we use? The question should be what problem should we be solving for? So actually thinking about it more broadly. I think same people, same work, chuck a tool over it and think you're going to have a transformational outcome. That's never going to happen. So you really have to be quite brave and courageous to go, how can we do this differently? And then I think expecting that some AI training is going to unlock value. Like, just because you know how to summarize a meeting doesn't mean that that's actually going to really transform how you operate. So getting close to the work and working with people to find different ways or better ways to do things. If you don't do that, then I don't think you're going to get the value.
Absolutely, yeah. What are the questions that leaders should be asking about AI that they're not?
So going to that point I've just made around what's the tool we should use, that type of sort of really narrow, linear sort of thinking, that's the piece that I think is those kind of questions stop people. So for me, it's about where's our business going? Where are the biggest opportunities? Those are the questions that they should be asking. How do we help our people adopt? How do we help people build the capabilities that they can be more effective with AI? So thinking again about the system, not just the technology, is going to be really important. Understanding what your people struggle with. And actually then how can we fix that? Because for me, transformation is some big things, but it can be a series of lots of little things. So if we really build and cut our teeth on fixing those small things, then actually we're going to build that capability muscle much more effectively in our organisation. So really for me, it's just asking questions is really important.
Yeah, again, that curiosity mindset.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, we don't know what we don't know. Unless you build awareness of what the tool set is, what its capabilities are, you're always going to struggle. Here's a good one. What's your favourite AI tool?
That's a real harsh one. So I have several tools that I use. I apologise. So I use Claude, I use ChatGPT, and I use Manus. I have 3 licenses. They're all very good for different things, and I use them specifically for different things. So as they are all evolving, they're becoming different in a lot of ways and then becoming similar in other ways. But I think for me, I can't build my consulting practice without having AI as a support partner, and I've spent a lot of time setting it up to deliver me value. And so the one thing I can suggest to people is either A, use an AI tool personally, so you get comfortable and confident with the capabilities of it. And if you can afford to invest in it for yourself personally, I would highly recommend it, because you can get so much more value out of it by creating kind of a personalised support system. But I think just try it. Like, just explore it, get curious about it, and get comfortable with it.
It is that experimentation mindset.
Totally.
Isn't it? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I agree with you with Claude. We've found co-work just absolutely incredible, and it's a mindset shift. It's just moving to a new frontier in terms of what capability is, and trying to think more expansively about what the possibilities are, which is exciting, but also daunting at the same time.
And I think there's a maturity scale too on it. Like I was doing some training with some people about prompting, and just saying, if you put in a basic prompt, you might as well just use Google, because it's no different. So actually the way that you think about prompting, even at a really simplistic level, will deliver you a much better outcome if you're really clear about setting its parameters and guardrails, so you can get information that's relative to you.
And get the chatbot to create its own prompt.
That's right.
How should I be writing this? Do you think the scale of SMEs in NZ is a barrier to AI adoption and the growth of skills domestically? Look, we kind of touched on this earlier as kind of scale being a superpower in some respect.
Yeah, I actually think this is an unlock and a great opportunity for New Zealand. I genuinely believe that. I think it doesn't matter if you're an SME through to a large enterprise. AI can help you unlock opportunity. And in fact, I think you've got to benefit the smaller you are, because some of the barriers to large organisations you're not going to have. You're going to be able to adapt quickly and easily. And so I think we need to lean into AI from a country and organisational state rather than actually step away.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, AI creates instant scale in some respects. You can be a 5-person business with a acting as a 500 employee business in some ways, and the only constraint on that is the capital cost of tokens.
That's right. And I think there's we've now got examples of unicorn organisations, which are billion-plus companies that have scaled with 20 people. And AI and technology has been the unlock for that.
5 years from now, what do you think will separate the organisations that successfully leverage this area of transformation from those that just simply deployed AI tools?
So I think if that sums up everything that I've talked about this morning, is one is around they've designed the system intentionally. So they've looked at their whole operating model. So how does work get delivered? What is the technology we use? Have we built the capabilities in our people? Have we created an organisation that can adapt and evolve easily? Have we focused on our culture? It's all of those things that make a great organisation. But the difference being we've been really intentional about it. And I think that's the thing, is that as we go into this next phase of whatever this next phase is being really clear about the design and delivery of your organisation, because that's the thing that's going to get you through and help you succeed.
Absolutely. It's an interesting one, and this is kind of a recurring theme, I think. How do you engage people for process mapping to enable an agent to be utilised for the benefit of the organisation, but at the same time it could cause job change or losses? And people are very aware of, they might be setting themselves up.
Yeah.
To, as their own executioner in some
It's
respects.
a really interesting one, and I think I've talked and debated with a few organisations in relation to this. So one, I think you need to be really clear with your people around what is your AI and people stance. Is it people first? Is it job first? Is it cost first? But also show your commitment to your workforce if those scenarios come about, that roles are affected. And that might be, we will always try and keep our workforce. We will always try and transition our workforce, but there are times that we can't. So actually being a lot more honest in relation to that. But often if you're changing processes, doesn't necessarily mean you don't need people anymore. And so I think part of this is, how do you build that sense of trust and openness and engagement and empathy when you're looking at these things as much as anything else. So I think just because you're doing a process map doesn't mean you're going to lose your job. You still need that value interaction of AI. We're not there yet.
Yeah, trust and empathy I think is key, as you say. Any ways that you've learned over the years of sort of building that in this sort of environment?
So again, this goes back to culture. What is the culture you're trying to create? And I think regardless of what the dynamics of your culture, I think now most importantly, if you can build highly engaged, high trusting organisations, people will go on that journey with you. My last sort of point to finish with is people will go where the puck is. So where is the puck for you from an organisation point of view? Where are you putting it forward? Because that's the bit back to intentionality and design of your organisation now.
Yeah, awesome. Final question then. What's the very next step people should take here? If they're in a leadership role and they're kind of AI aware, but not necessarily embracing, what would you recommend people go out and do as a next step?
So a couple of things, and I've probably talked about this before, but one, where are you spending your time as an organisation? What conversations are you having? They're the first two things if you're sitting around a leadership table. And what is your attitude to AI right now, really and honestly, as a business? And what should it be? If you had those three conversations in an open way, I think that's a really good place to start.
Agreed. That is a good place for us to end. Really appreciate your insight on this. There's been so much there. We've covered a huge amount of ground.
I know.
You are pretty prominent on LinkedIn as well. I'm just thinking if people want to sort of expose themselves, as it were, to more of your thinking, they can connect with you on LinkedIn. Look up Unboxable, and I'm no doubt open to conversations with people if they want to reach out directly and have a chat about AI and what it means for their organisation.
More than happy to. And I think the thing is as we go through this really significant time of change in whatever context that means, having those conversations, connecting with people is going to make it. we're going through this together, right? So more than happy to have a coffee and a chat, or help you with your organisation. But more importantly, on an individual level, I think, for me, it's about the people that you're connecting with and the conversations that you're having. So really happy to have that.
Well said. Awesome. All right. Well, a good place to leave it. Thanks everybody for joining us. Hope you've taken away as much as I have and enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.